a millennium, to be exact. From Mike Judge, creator of Office Space and Beavis and Butthead.
Back then, when I watched Idiocracy, I still vividly remember the image of Joe Bowers standing bewildered in a world where everyone screamed in each other's faces. I remember President Kamacho roaring on stage with guns and fireworks like it was a wrestling arena. And I remember laughing because everything was so over the top, so stupid, so exaggerated that it couldn't possibly be taken seriously. At the time, I thought Idiocracy was just a rough joke, a movie that deliberately made every character dumb so the audience could feel smarter. It was only when I began digging into the behind-the-scenes stories that I was jolted by the realization Idiocracy was never conceived as a harmless comedy. It originated from a very real moment at Disneyland, was quickly regarded by Hollywood as an insult to mass democracy, was released quietly as if the studio itself was afraid for people to see it, and it contained jokes so prophetic that just a few years later, the entire world would be forced to live with them. And here are the 20 strangest, most surprising and darkest facts about Idiocracy you've probably never known. 20. Idiocracy began at Disneyland. I still remember watching Idiocracy as a way to blow off steam, laughing at a future that seemed far too exaggerated and far too stupid to be taken seriously. So years later, when I read that the film's idea had actually occurred to Mike Judge in a place known as the happiest place on earth, I was forced to see it through an entirely different lens. On a family trip to Disneyland, Mike Judge witnessed a painfully real scene. Two mothers, their children sitting in strollers standing in the middle of a theme park for kids screaming obscenities at each other non-stop. No one was embarrassed. No one backed down. No one cared that children were hearing every single word. The moment stopped Judge in his tracks. Not because of the rudeness, but because of something far more unsettling. This behaviour was completely normal. And then a thought surfaced, chilling in its simplicity. How horrifying would it be if the future of humanity looked exactly like this? From that moment, the premise of Idiocracy took shape. A society where stupidity and vulgarity are no longer shameful, but the norm. Where such behaviour doesn't stop at one generation, but is passed directly into the way children are raised, not through doctrine, but through daily example. The irony is that Judge didn't see that future in a laboratory or in politics. He saw it in a park meant for children as if it were the first demo of the world to come. 19. The jokes in the film became real life. Almost everyone shares the same feeling the first time they watch Idiocracy. They laugh, because everything is so excessive. But years later, when you revisit it, that feeling starts to flip. Not because the film is less funny, but because real life has begun to resemble it in deeply unsettling ways. Take the clearest example, Brawndo. In the film, plain water is considered useless. Everything from humans to crops runs on an energy drink with electrolytes. Back then it was a stupid joke. But in real life, energy drink ads began echoing nearly identical slogans. Energy, electrolytes, power, you need it. Idiocracy wasn't mocking technology. It was mocking how advertising manipulates human behaviour. Or Costco. In the film, Costco functions like a miniature state bureaucratic absurd and beyond challenge. Watching it today, many people shudder at how closely it mirrors the commercialisation of education pay to get a degree, no real learning required. In Idiocracy, Costco was a joke. In real life, it's a model. And finally, television. In the film, the dumber a show is, the more airtime it gets. Audiences laugh because they don't have to think. In real life, reality TV viral clips and digital content operate the same way. The more shocking, the simpler, the easier to consume, the more it gets pushed. Many fans admit bitterly, real-life reality shows are more idiocracy than Idiocracy itself. 18. Mike Judge was seen as going too far and insulting America. Do you remember the feeling when Idiocracy was released? It didn't spark public outrage. No protests, no loud debates, just a very strange silence. Years later, when Mike Judge began speaking honestly about what happened behind the scenes, people finally understood why. Judge admitted that during internal screenings, several studio executives felt personally offended. Some outright called Idiocracy anti-American, not because it attacked a particular party or policy, but because it did something far more dangerous. It satirized the entire system they were living inside. The film doesn't take sides. It doesn't target only politics or television or education. It depicts a consumer society where everything, elections, schooling, entertainment, corporations, runs on cheap emotions and extreme simplification. And what made many people in Hollywood uneasy was realizing they weren't outside that picture. Some industry insiders admitted plainly that Idiocracy hits directly at Hollywood's core audience. In other words, it mocked the very people who were paying distributing and deciding what was allowed to exist. That may be why Fox didn't dare promote it heavily, didn't dare stand proudly behind it, and ultimately chose the safest option, silence, letting the film fade away. Not because it was wrong, but because it was too right. 17. Crocs: A Prophecy. Born from a lack of money. When I first watched Idiocracy, I only remembered those weird plastic shoes as a tiny visual gag. I never imagined there would come a day when the maid appeared on the street, in shopping malls, or on the feet of celebrities. But years later, when I happened to hear Mike Judge tell the behind-the-scenes story, that feeling changed instantly. The budget for Idiocracy was extremely tight. The costume department needed shoes that looked futuristic, strange, but cheap, very cheap. No major brands, no expensive licensing. One designer made a suggestion there was an obscure startup making ugly plastic shoes with holes all over them. They looked awful, but they were cheap. Judge hesitated and asked a very reasonable question. What if by the time the movie comes out, these shoes somehow become popular? The answer made the room burst out laughing. No way, no one would ever wear these. Those shoes were Crocs. In Idiocracy, Crocs were chosen because they represented a dumb future society, one where aesthetics, function, and shame had all disappeared. But ironically, after the film's release, Crocs exploded worldwide, becoming a mass fashion symbol embraced by celebrities and major brands. And that's when a chilling paradox emerged. Idiocracy didn't predict Crocs. It accidentally created them, a prop from a stupid future walking confidently straight into the present. 16. Maya Rudolph and the contrast between a stupid future and real motherhood. Do you remember Maya Rudolph in Idiocracy? In a world where everyone screams in each other's faces and replaces thought with profanity, she appears as a strangely bright spot, a time-travelling prostitute who is nevertheless introduced as the smartest person in the future. At the time, that paradox made us laugh. A character who is both clear-headed and sharp, standing in the middle of chaos, as if she were holding on to the last scraps of reason for the entire film. But in real life, Maya Rudolph's story took a very different turn. In October 2005, before Idiocracy even reached theatres, she gave birth to her first child. While the film was abandoned by its studio and released quietly as if it had never existed, her real life entered a kind of turmoil of an entirely different sort, becoming a mother, raising a child, and stepping away from the spotlight for a long time. The contrast is chilling. On screen, she represents the last remaining intelligence of the future. In real life, she became a mother in the present, facing the real world with no script and no canned laughter. On one side is a stupid future written to provoke laughs. On the other is a very real present where responsibility and maternal instinct replace every sharp line of dialogue. And perhaps it is precisely this contrast that makes Maya Rudolph's role feel more haunting in hindsight. Terry Crews admits the role of Kamacho now frightens him. When Idiocracy was released, President Kamacho was the character that got the biggest laughs in theatres. Terry Crews played a muscle-bound president who swore, waved guns, and shouted on stage like a pro wrestler entering the ring. At the time, Kamacho was pure comedy exaggerated to the point where it couldn't possibly be taken seriously. Terry Crews himself once believed that. He admitted that while filming he thought he was going too far, pushing everything into absurdity so the audience would never mistake it for reality. A harmless political farce. But years later, as the world changed, Crews began to say something different. He admitted that when he looks back at the role today, he's no longer sure it was just comedy. Kamacho rules by emotion. He's elected for excitement, he shouts instead of arguing. Guns muscles and loud confidence are treated as leadership qualities. And then a deeply unsettling moment emerges. Kamacho stops being a character. He becomes a real fear in the mind of the man who created him. When the actor himself starts to fear the character he once played, Crews said, "It's no longer comedy," and the laughter from back then begins to fade very quickly. 14. Arrest records, so stupid they become honest. Do you remember the scene where Joe is arrested by the police in Costco? At the time, many people laughed at the electronic board in the background because it looked so ridiculous. The listed reasons for arrest were embarrassingly blunt. Because he's an asshole for escaping prison, for causing lots of bad stuff. No statutes, no legal clauses, just feelings. Back then, we laughed thinking this was classic Mike Judge exaggeration. But on closer inspection, it turns out to be one of the film's most disturbing details. Idiocracy doesn't say that future society has no laws. It says that society no longer has the intelligence to describe its laws. Administrative language, once demanding absolute precision, has been reduced to crude insults. And when laws are no longer defined in clear terms, ambiguity becomes a tool of control. You're not arrested for violating a specific statute. You're arrested because they don't like you. It's a form of rule that requires no reasoning, no proof, just a majority nodding along. And suddenly the old joke is no longer harmless because it cuts straight into a very real fear shared by any society. 13. Brawndo the film was buried, but the brand was bought. There's a very Idiocracy-style paradox that few people notice. While the film itself was nearly made to disappear by Fox, no promotion, no trailers, no red carpets, the same studio actively purchased the rights to the Brawndo brand. Yes, Brawndo, the absurd energy drink with electrolytes that plants crave. The intention was clear. Separate Brawndo from the film's miserable fate and sell it as a real-world product. A satirical joke stripped out of the very movie that was mocking it. The result was perfectly ironic. Brawndo became popular, sought after by fans, and some people genuinely enjoyed drinking it. Meanwhile, Idiocracy, the film that created Brawndo, wasn't even properly credited on theatre posters. Today, the official website Brawndo.com no longer exists, but the trace remains. Brawndo became one of the very few cinematic jokes to escape the screen and step into real life. 12. The Surgeon General's warning. A small joke with a big meaning. In Idiocracy, there's a tiny detail many people miss. On a Tarleton cigarette billboard, the US Surgeon General's warning is shrunk down to the point of being almost unreadable. And when you strain to read it, the message is completely absurd. Warning. The Surgeon General has only one lung and one vocal cord, but he can still kick your sorry ass. Back then, it was just a throwaway joke. But its satirical intent is razor sharp. A health warning, something meant to protect public well-being, has been turned into a cheap macho threat drowned in loud visuals and noise. Idiocracy isn't saying that future society denies danger. It's saying that society no longer has the attention span or intelligence to care. The truth still exists, but it's been shrunk to fit a culture so loud that everything has to scream just to be seen. And that's why the punchline of this detail is chilling in Idiocracy. Danger doesn't disappear, it's simply reduced until no one bothers to read it. 11. Reversed brand placement. The more brands, the safer you are legally. The first time I watched Idiocracy, I remember laughing at the absurd density of brand names: Starbucks, Carl's Jr., Costco, everywhere, completely unhidden and unblurred. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than an exaggerated joke about consumer culture. But behind that laughter was a very real fear from Mike Judge. He was afraid of being sued for parodying brands, and the solution he chose was both funny and clever mock everything. When every brand is ridiculed, no single brand can claim to be the sole victim. The result was a reversed form of product placement. Instead of subtle advertising, Idiocracy puts brands out in the open, making them look ridiculous and suspicious. And the real irony is this many corporations were perfectly fine with it. Not because they enjoyed being mocked, but because they were confident of one thing: this movie would never be widely released. 10. Media and Oh My Balls. Do you remember the show Ow My Balls? A man is repeatedly hit in the groin and the entire future society laughs hysterically because no thinking is required. At the time, it felt like the cheapest joke in the film, the kind of comedy you were certain could exist only in fiction. Mike Judge has said that he didn't predict the future of television. He simply saw the trajectory. Even in the present, at the time, shock-based, pain-based, humiliation-based programs were already starting to win. Ow My Balls was just the final push entertainment that requires no language, no context, no meaning. At the same time, Idiocracy depicts a near-future version of Fox News that is almost unchanged except for exaggerated hair and intensity. No need to distort the message. Just turn up the volume. A few years later, real life caught up. Fast fail compilations, viral clips, content that spreads faster the more shocking it is. Many fans looking back now admit Idiocracy wasn't prophecy. It simply pointed out that when media follows the path of least resistance, the destination is already set. 9. A Buried Alive release. You might not clearly remember when Idiocracy was released in theatres, and that's exactly the problem. The film was released in a way many people in the industry openly describe as being buried alive. No trailers, no posters, no red carpet, no press campaign. Some theatres screened it for just 1 week, even displaying a shockingly cold title on the marquee untitled Mike Judge Project, as if the studio were deliberately erasing its own child. More absurdly, some actors involved didn't even know the film had been released until it was already over. No statements, no explanations. But the unspoken message was crystal clear: don't let anyone see it. Not because Idiocracy was bad, but because it was the kind of film that, if seen widely enough, would make too many people uncomfortable, from audiences and the media to the very people operating the system it was mocking. And so Idiocracy was pushed into oblivion. Until time proved one thing: some films don't need marketing because reality will do the job for them. 8. Acting like a cartoon and a dangerous line. One of Mike Judge's most important directions for Idiocracy was act like a cartoon. Not realistic acting, no psychological depth, no need for logic. Every gesture, line and reaction had to be pushed to extremes, as if the characters were drawings that could talk. Judge's goal was clear: this had to be an absurd future, not a malicious one. But that very choice placed the production on a dangerously thin line. During filming, some extras crossed that line. Certain crude behaviours, discriminatory jokes, and offensive expressions appeared not because the script called for them, but because people thought that was what the film was encouraging. Judge was forced to intervene, cut scenes, and rein in performances. This revealed an uncomfortable truth. When you satirise stupidity, there is always a risk of being mistaken for endorsing it. Judge didn't want the future in the film to feel hateful. He wanted it to be frightening in its emptiness, a world where people aren't evil, just no longer thinking. 7. A self-fulfilling warning. There's a very Idiocracy-style paradox that only became clear years later. The film satirises anti-intellectualism, and then it was treated as something too dangerous to be sold to the mass market. Studios feared Idiocracy was hard to sell, too offensive, not audience-friendly. Not because it was excessively violent or sexual, but because it questioned collective intelligence, something any mass entertainment industry is deeply afraid of. The result was a box office disaster, about $400,000 a figure, that barely exists in theatrical release history. No promotion, no opportunity, no audience. And this is where Idiocracy's warning began to fulfill itself. A film that says society will ignore anything that forces people to think was ignored in exactly that way. Idiocracy didn't fail. Despite being right, it failed because it was right too early. 6. Kamacho was meant to return, but the studio backed away. At one point, many years after Idiocracy became a cult film, the idea of bringing President Camacho back was floated. Not a full sequel, but commercials, cameos, or election season tie-ins a way to play with collective memory. But the idea never made it past the studio gates. The reason passed around quietly in the industry was simple and unsettling. Kamacho now looked too real. No longer a safe caricature. No longer exaggerated comedy. He had started to resemble a direct reflection, and no one wanted to stand in front of that mirror on the big screen. Fox backed away, not because the idea was weak, but because there was no longer enough distance to laugh. When the line between satire and reality blurs, a brand stops being a joke and becomes a liability. And so Kamacho remains in Idiocracy, frozen in place like a framed warning. 5. From comedy to documentary and the DVD revival. There's a strange moment when you rewatch Idiocracy nearly 10 years later. You don't laugh the way you used to, not because the film has gotten worse, but because so much of it no longer feels like satire. Lines that were once criticised as lazy, mean-spirited or crude start to sound disturbingly familiar. Mike Judge noticed this too. In later interviews, he gradually stopped calling Idiocracy a comedy and half-jokingly, half-seriously began referring to it as a documentary. Not because the film predicted every detail correctly, but because the social trajectory it outlined no longer seemed exaggerated. The irony is that Idiocracy didn't survive on box office revenue. It survived on DVD in college dorms, midnight screenings, then on Reddit, YouTube, and meme culture. Lines once dismissed as too stupid became meme scripture. People quote the film not to laugh but to sigh. A movie once accused of looking down on the masses was ultimately saved by the younger masses themselves. 4. An older inspiration. The Marching Morons, 1951. Many people think Idiocracy is a completely new idea, born from modern cynicism. But Mike Judge has never hidden the opposite. The core idea of the film appeared long ago. One of his biggest inspirations was the 1951 science fiction short story, The Marching Morons by C.M. Cornbluth. The story poses a chilling hypothesis. Intelligent people gradually stop having children, while less educated people reproduce uncontrollably. The result isn't instant catastrophe, but a slow, logical, and terrifying societal decline. Judge read that story not as science fiction, but as a forgotten warning. He didn't believe he was imagining the future. He believed he was continuing a fear that had existed since the mid-20th century, only now dressed in the language of television advertising and mass consumer culture. And that's the crucial point. Idiocracy wasn't born from pure imagination. It was born from what Judge saw every day and from what he feared people would laugh off, then ignore. 3. The original title was hated. Few people know that Idiocracy almost premiered under a far more shocking name. The original title Mike Judge proposed was the United States of America, but spelled phonetically, deliberately, wrong and crude like a slap straight to national pride. For Judge, it wasn't cheap provocation, but a blunt way of stating what the film was implying: a society capable of distorting even its own name. Fox's reaction was almost immediate. Internally, the studio felt the title was too aggressive, too hard to market, and above all, offensive. Not offensive to a small group, but to everyone. Some executives worried that the title alone would turn the film into a target before audiences even saw its content. In the end, both sides compromised on the title Idiocracy. More neutral, safer, less confrontational, but the discomfort remained: a title rejected for being too honest. 2. The Office Space cast returns like an echo. If you watched Office Space before Idiocracy, you may have felt a sense of familiarity without quite noticing it. Mike Judge has a very particular habit. He reuses actors not just because they fit the roles, but because they carry the same soul he's continuing to explore. In Office Space, that soul belongs to people crushed by office life, by an indifferent system, by meaningless rules they're forced to obey. They aren't stupid, they're exhausted. They understand the problem, but are powerless to change it. In Idiocracy, those familiar faces return as a warped, evolutionary version. No longer the quiet resignation of the office, but the loud, crude emptiness of mass society. If Office Space is a sigh inside a cubicle, Idiocracy is a scream in the town square. What's important is that the two films don't contradict each other. They feel like two chapters of the same story. One shows people suffocated by the system. The other shows people dissolving into the system's own stupidity until they no longer remember they were ever suffocated. 1. Easter eggs and the final payoff. There's a tiny detail at the beginning of Idiocracy that many people skim past and then forget. It's the family tree shown in the opening montage, explaining how the future went wrong. Look closely and you'll notice names that are strangely familiar. Hank Hill, the iconic character from King of the Hill, appears in the future bloodline. There's even a goat. This isn't a random joke. It's Mike Judge blending his entire creative universe into Idiocracy. People who once lived decently, worked hard, and believed in reason like Hank Hill don't disappear. They're diluted, thinned out, and eventually overwhelmed in the biological and cultural current of the future. The motif running through that opening is simple. Don't think too much. The film delivers it gently, almost reassuringly. But it's precisely when you start thinking more when you pause at the family tree, the familiar names, the seemingly meaningless details that the chill sets in. Idiocracy doesn't say intelligence is destroyed overnight. It says intelligence is diluted little by little until there's not enough left to even realize when it was lost. And when you look back at Idiocracy as a whole, from its origin at Disneyland through its seemingly harmless jokes to the way it was buried alive and then quietly resurrected as a documentary, perhaps the most frightening thing isn't the future Mike Judge imagined, but our own reaction to it. We laughed, we thought it was too exaggerated. We believed we were smart enough to never become that world, and maybe that's the coldest warning Judge left behind. A society doesn't collapse because of malice, but because people gradually get used to not caring anymore. What about you? When you watch the film today, which detail sends the biggest chill down your spine? Or do you realize you once laughed at moments that no longer feel funny at all? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy deep dives into what lies beneath films, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories where cinema isn't just entertainment, but a mirror held up to the world we're living in.